Hi,
Rhonda,
Jen.
welcome to the Growing Through It podcast.
Hi, Jen. How are you?
Oh, good. It is good to see your face.
Thank you.
Rhonda, you've been in leadership for a little over 20 years.
Yes.
Not to date you, because I'm the same. We're same age.
We're not
And
in the decades there.
I know it goes fast, it goes fast. But the leadership story you're going to take us through, just for context setting, was about 7 years ago. So I just want to
That's
tell
right.
the audience where you're pulling your story from, and then I'm just going to let you tell us.
Absolutely. So I'm pulling this from about 7 years ago. Of course, that's pre-COVID. And I will set the stage that I had gone to school for hospitality management at UNLV, which my reason for doing that is I have a major love for travel. And so why not choose that as my career path? And in that, I had always wanted to work for a number one resort and top notch, very big, large enterprise. And so I was super thrilled to have landed this opportunity working on the Las Vegas Strip and fortunate enough to even be a part of an organization that was a Fortune 500. So, in that position, my role was to manage the administrative team that handled contracting. And it was an all new arena for me. I had in previous roles managed hotel positions, but this it was more of a back of house type of role. And I was new at getting to know the landscape of a large organization. And so this was my first largest organization. So, in that position, I was invited to get to know my team. And that's a huge piece for me is building trust. So, major focus was one-on-ones with each and every person that reported to me.
And how many people was that, Rhonda?
At the time, I believe I had 14 direct reports.
That's a
And
lot.
so it was, and it was probably the largest team I had had in
Mhm.
my career. And I wanted to hear them out and listen to exactly, what was working well, what wasn't working. And it had come across that several of them had shared that they had supported smaller managers before, because each of them supported managers in their work. And that this recent change that started prior to me joining meant that they were doubling up on how many people they were to support. And
You
so
mean from a business, just for context, so for like a business perspective, they were doing contracting across the
correct,
business. And so they had
correct.
more internal customers.
That's
Is that right?
exactly right.
Okay.
That's right. So it's my understanding that it initially was 2 to 1. It now had grown to 4 and sometimes up to 5 to 1. And at the time, again, being new to the position, I was more of just putting on a listening ear to try to understand the why behind that. And so at the time I reported to the director of operations, I had shared my findings that this was across the board a concern for them that while they took on more responsibility, that didn't equate to higher hourly wage. And so when, and I've learned in a lot of ways when it comes to the pay side of things, there's only so much that a middle manager can do, and that a lot of those decisions are made higher above. And so my director shared, well, why don't you put together a presentation and outline that the duties have increased, and therefore that means that there is a justification why we would potentially evaluate them receiving income increases as well.
No, that's
And
promising.
so that was totally, I
Hmm.
said, I am open to this. Let's jump in and let's research it. And again, very large organization, I reached out to HR. HR has always been my partner. And I had a designated person that was assigned to me. And they said, well, we base pay off of a competitive wage analysis. And we do that, certain time of year. And I'm happy to share that, I have that data, but I can certainly get approval to share that data with you. And I said, I would appreciate that. Thank you so much. Time had passed, 2 to 3 months had passed, and I'd received phone calls from my HR rep, and they, they were kind of keeping me up to date on things. And then eventually I got a phone call that was something like, well, we haven't done an analysis in the last 2 years, but we can look at doing a new one. And I said I would highly appreciate that. And we left it at that. And so the following day, I start my day, and I receive a phone call from my director. And I immediately, upon walking into his office, could tell it was going to be a serious conversation. And so the door is closed, and I could tell that he was nervous. There was just nonverbal cues. I could sense there was something important that he was about to say. And he basically he questioned, why did I think it was acceptable to ask for HR to run another pay analysis on those positions? And so I walked him back to the time where you shared that I could prepare a deck, and so that I would have my research in place to request for my direct reports to get a raise.
And what time frame was that between this meeting and then, I mean, approximate months, 6 months?
It was probably 2 to 3 months.
2 to 3 months. Okay.
And so I'm refreshing on what conversation was had.
Mhm.
And clearly what I'm sensing is that he had forgotten what he told me to do. And so he says something that, as he said it, it took me a while to process it. But he basically said, you are allowing the tail of the dog to wag the dog's direction. And it was just such a alarming, sentence that I kind of paused, and I didn't have a response. I was just more in shock. And so he said that ultimately what had happened was my call triggered the VP levels to figure out what was happening. And then that triggered the departmental VP of my team to get a call that, like, hey, why is somebody from your team requesting this? This is a major ask. We have a huge process in place for this. It's an organization of thousands. And ultimately, I don't believe he backed me up in any way. I don't believe he said the reason that Rhonda did this is because I advised her to put together a presentation. And I definitely felt very alone in that moment.
And also, it seems as though, and correct me if I'm wrong, when the HR person said, hey, do you want me to just run an analysis on it? It seemed as though, from the way you just said the story, it wasn't a big ordeal, right? It was like, do you want
It
me to put
didn't
the
seem as though it was a big ordeal. And I later learned that that person was probably also doing what they believed was in the best interest of the team. And it could have been that it's something that it wasn't a written policy, but as they progressed to find out, they probably also learned that it wasn't acceptable to go about things in that way. And ultimately, I don't regret trying to figure out if I could do better for my department. I don't regret that part. What I do regret is that I wish I had studied the landscape of the department and the company as a whole and understood what it meant to ask for something that would require corporate approval. Because what I ultimately ended up being was almost on the radar as, quote unquote, the troublemaker or the person that's going to cause us trouble.
So let me I want to go to what you learned, because that is also very important. So you said your boss gave you that feedback. You felt alone in the moment. Do you remember, like, were there any like takeaways from that? Was it basically just stop, this isn't allowed? Like go about your business and just go manage these people? Do you remember, like, kind of what that was a while ago, how that meeting ended? And was there like, did it feel like you were getting like a slap on the wrist?
Absolutely. Unequivocally, I had done the wrong thing. It wasn't it wasn't the protocol of the organization. It was overstepping my role. And more than that, I don't believe that that would have been the way to do it. Even if I had gotten the okay, I still should have used my internal department channels before I had chucked it to the next department.
Got it. And so did he remember the conversation you had and say, oh, that's not what I meant? Like, I didn't mean for you to do this? Or was it just kind of, oh yeah, I acknowledge it, but hey, didn't go the right way?
He acknowledged the conversation being had, but he did not support that I had reached out to get this data.
Got it. And did your team know you were working on this for them?
No.
Oh, thank God, right? At least like they weren't caught in the middle of it.
They
That's a
weren't
good
caught.
thing.
I was open and said I would look into their concerns about a potential increase in pay, but they didn't realize that I was dealing with a back end bureaucracy of how that would look. And nor was I giving them updates along the way. That wasn't how I decided to keep it very discreet. So it was really the only ones that knew were my team member, HR representative, and my director. But those were the only two people that knew.
And tell me what happened in the subsequent months from that. You said that you were labeled as the troublemaker, and how did that like
So by
look
the
to
way, that
you?
was never said. Like that
Oh,
wasn't it wasn't said out loud, right? But I at that point, the result of that was it was perpetual. It was getting ignored in the halls. It was being uninvited from certain management meetings.
talk about
Um,
like dial in on that a little bit, because I know we've talked offline about this, but like you were in management meetings and then all of a sudden after this incident, you were
taken
taking
off.
off and you
Yeah.
were the only one taking off.
It was me, my whole department.
Okay.
But the reasoning was, oh, it's the information being relayed is not relatable to your team. So we decided to take you off.
Okay.
So it was a lot of that. It was a lot of that. And also just a lot of questioning how I was making decisions by my direct boss, or why did you think that that was okay to do? It was a lot of things like in that nature.
And how long did that go on for? Like before you started kind of seeing the writing on the wall, like this isn't
Uh,
going to work.
it probably went on for a couple of years, I would say. Not the interactions were few and far between, but I did wind up getting a new director probably a year and a half after that. And
Okay.
so I was able to start fresh with somebody else, which I thought was valuable. And I had learned a lot in that year and a half of just how are things done at this organization, and what may have worked in an organization of, for example, 500 or less doesn't work in an organization of thousands. It's near impossible for it to work that way, and that there has to be certain structures in place.
Yeah, and that's one of the things you said is like you would have maybe done it a different way or not done it at all or gone to your internal channels. But is there anything else that you learned from this experience that just made you a stronger leader? Like now that you're continuing in leadership, what did you learn from that perspective?
I learned to ask more questions. I learned to, if somebody who I'm new at reporting to, who I essentially want to know if they are trustworthy or that they would have my back, that I could ask several questions to get an understanding. Okay, well, if we did that, what do you believe the next steps would be? Or is this within company policy? Or is there a procedure for something like this? I think those are questions that are fair of anybody that's new to an organization, especially to a management position. Just ask questions, be curious.
Yeah, I think that's a good lesson because I don't
Yeah.
ask a lot either. So it's just like, all right, I would have seen myself doing the same thing you did. And I want
Yeah.
to go back to that role. So when you got the new director, did you feel like you could overcome that label as a troublemaker, or did you feel like even with the new director, it was like the
I
ship has
could
sailed?
overcome.
You
I
could.
could overcome. I think the new director was approachable. And I think we were at that point dealt with a very hard thing, which was COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to immediately drop down any of the uncomfortability and barriers and get in the weeds of how are we going to lead? How are we going to pivot? And so I think that ultimately built a trust. And it could have been in that circumstance, but it could have also been how their leadership was. And I still have a pretty great working relationship with that person. We've kept in touch. So ultimately, I shared what that story was with him because I wanted him to be made aware that this is something that might have painted a picture of what I was like as a leader and shed a light on me that maybe wasn't favorable. And that's the other thing. I think there was my style of leadership is very, I want to be a resource for those that report to me and ultimately provide them communication and guidance. But I think in big organizations, there's very much like team line employee, team manager. And if you're team manager, you need to only think like a manager and not advocate because you're team manager and it's what the corporation wants you to do is how you need to behave. And so I think that there was a lot of that I was also coming to terms with.
That your natural leadership style didn't gel, it sounds like,
Correct.
right?
That is
It
correct.
just that is who you are. You're going to be an advocate and a resource for your people. And if you can't be that type of manager, it'd be hard to be successful in that
I
culture.
think so. I think so. I think it's tough to be an advocate when you're in an organization that's that large. I'm going back to the size again. I think
Mm-hmm.
when you're dealing with hundreds or a division of hundreds, it becomes harder and you want to lead in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And I think too, when you're talking about COVID, it's like, shoot, once COVID happens, it's like anything before that, forget about it. Like it's just not even that important
There's a
anymore,
before
right?
COVID way of leadership and there was an after COVID way of leadership. And we learned a lot about that time.
Right. Especially in hospitality, right?
Absolutely, especially in hospitality.
So, Rhonda, what advice would you give leaders on the kind of politics, office politics, right? That realm. It doesn't have to be in that realm, but that's one thing that all leaders face in any size organization. There's politics, maybe more in larger organizations than others. But do you have any advice regarding office politics or another area of leadership that you'd want to offer advice?
I would say the advice I would have is to develop a mentor or a buddy system that somebody like-minded that may have navigated through a new and a unique environment that at the very least they're a sounding board. But what may be even better is that they have actually gone through a process or a step or a crossroads and knew what to do and could tell you what worked for them. And I don't think leadership books are great in theory, but until you actually know who the players are, it's hard to determine what the outcome is going to be in some of this. And then also the other advice is you are going to mess up. That's ultimately the biggest advice is that we are not a black and white, this is how you do it at all times type of position. We have to know there's going to be decisions that we make that will not always land well. And we have to be okay with the imperfect decisions as well.
Yeah. Yeah. We're all going to make mistakes. I've made plenty of them. That's why this whole podcast was created, because we all have this treasure trove of mistakes. But I
Yes.
love what you said about
Yes.
leadership books, because I love leadership books. But when you get in the thick of things and you've got all of the different factors, because a leadership book would probably say, go advocate for your team, be a resource, be a coach.
Right. That's right.
And that wouldn't work in the organization that you were working in, right? Not necessarily. Maybe it could, maybe there's a way for it to fit, but it didn't fit for you.
No, it did not fit for me. And I think the books are great to teach you how to think and to provide you with an approach or a philosophy, but it also is super different when you're actually delivering the information or you're actually trying to follow what that particular author wrote. Um, so I'm still learning every single day.
That's what makes you a great leader, Rhonda. You're learning from it, because how many leaders screw up and don't learn from it? They keep making the same
And making the
mistake.
same errors, right?
Right. So, Rhonda, anything else you want to leave listeners with? And it's okay if there's nothing, but just wanted to give you some space.
I would say go into a new role, go in with an open mindset that in your first year, you will be questioning every decision you make, and that is okay. And the screw ups are actually there for a reason. They're the guardrails that help you stay on task and enjoy the journey. Laugh at yourself because there will be a lot of moments where you're like, wow, what did I do there? And hopefully you've got a good friend or a good mentor to help you along the way.
Absolutely. That support is crucial. Well,
Yeah.
Rhonda, thank you for taking us through what wasn't really a pleasant experience for you. And I'm sure it still feels like it was yesterday, even though it was 7 years ago. I could just kind of feel what you went through, that nervousness of, that you're not going to hear great news, and
Yeah.
getting through it and sharing that story. I think it will be really helpful to the listeners.
Thank you so much, Jen. I appreciate you. Thanks for having me on today.